First day as an apprentice. After taking the test, going through the verbal interviews, and calling the business agent every day for a year, I was finally awarded my apprenticeship in the plumbing trade. I was working as a laborer on a construction job when the business agent came up to me and gave me the good news. He told me to show up at a plumbing shop in town the very next day to start my apprenticeship. I was excited and ready to go. I arrived early the next morning and sat in the car until the people started to show up for work. I went in and thought I would introduce myself. What I didn't know was that as an apprentice you went through a period of hazing. It started early that morning. They asked me who the hell I was. The first thing they asked me was for my referral. I had no idea in the world what that was. I didn't have one, and I didn't have any idea how to get one. They just let me stand there. Finally, one of the guys said, "Are you going to just stand there, or are you going to go get one?" I asked what it was and where to get one. Of course, the reply was, "You're dumber than you look. It's doubtful you'll ever make it. Go back to the union hall, talk to the business agent, and he'll babysit you. We haven't got time." Off I went. I could hear him laughing as I left the building. I finally got the referral and came back to the shop. By this time, everybody had gone to work except for Elmer. He was waiting for me. They assigned me to him as a helper, and I introduced myself. He told me, "I don't care what your name is. To me, your name's Boy," and off we went. Once in the van, I tried to make conversation, and he ignored me. Elmer got out of the van after arriving at the first site and started walking toward the building. I just followed. He went into a dark and dirty basement and finally told me we were going to remove a human waste lift pump. Then he just stood there. Finally, I asked when we were going to start. He looked at me and said, "I thought you were supposed to be smart to get an apprenticeship. This might seem like a stretch, but you can't do any work without tools." I looked at him puzzled. He looked back and yelled, "Go out to the fucking truck and get the tools." I went out to the van, opened the rear door, and found it full of tools, none of which I knew what they did. It was a mess. The tools were all in a pile, cords wrapped around each other and unorganized. I saw 2 toolboxes and picked them up. These were 2 of the heaviest things I've ever lifted in my life. I lugged them into the building, down the stairs, and by now sweating like a madman. I set them down in front of him. Of course, he looked at the boxes and said, "We're going to remove a pump, not do air conditioning repair. Take those tools back to the van. I'll get the fucking things myself." A few minutes later, he came back with a handful of tools. I looked over, saw a pump setting in a pool of water, with human waste floating all around it. The water was nasty. That's when he told me I had to put my foot in a loop of rope attached to a large movable arm, and he was going to swing me out above the wastewater. I was to get the pump unbolted, and I was to hook it up so it could be lifted. Without further discussion over the water, he swung me. He finally centered me above the pump, and I had to bend down and hook the cable to the lifting eye. I couldn't keep from touching the water and the waste on that pump. I didn't know where they came from, but suddenly I had bugs running up my arm. I couldn't let go, and the stink was getting to me, so I started to gag. "Don't you let go, boy," he yelled. I got the pump hooked up, and he pulled me back in. We lifted the pump out of the water and carried it out of the building. Of course, I didn't have any gloves, and I had human waste all over me, and was doing the best I could to keep from puking. The pump had become frozen due to being clogged with compacted waste. We took it back to the shop. Odie was the man at the shop who handed out tools, made material runs, and kept things in order. When we arrived, he told us we weren't putting that pump in the shop. We had to set up some stands and put it next to the building outside in the sun. They told me that my job for the rest of the day was to clean up that pump. Elmer gave me a putty knife, a brush, and some muriatic acid. He told me to brush on the muriatic acid, wait for a few minutes, and start scraping with the putty knife. I diligently went to work trying to make a good impression. With the pump located outside, directly in the hot sun, it stunk terrible. Never having been around this stuff before, I got sick. I would scrape for a while and puke for a while. I worked all afternoon and was happy I'd gotten as far as I did. When Elmer returned to the shop at the end of the day, he came around the side of the building and immediately threw a fit. "Why aren't you done?" I told him I'd worked hard at it and I would stay to get it done. I kept thinking I was going to get fired on my first day. Elmer was standing there and said, "If you were half as smart as you need to be, you would be done. Go get that hose." As I rounded the corner with the hose, he was brushing more muriatic acid on the pump. After waiting a few minutes, he picked up the hose and sprayed water over the pump. The waste just flew off, and in just a few minutes was all removed. "Sharpen up, boy, or you'll never make it." I could see all the shop guys out of the corner of my eye laughing. This was my first day as an apprentice. Welcome to the trades. I made up my mind that day that no matter how hard it would be, this was an opportunity, and they couldn't beat me hard enough to get me to quit. Elmer, in his own way, was a very talented man, although he was unwilling to share any of his talents. Our first call on a refrigeration problem was another learning experience. We arrived at a building that was 4 stories high, and a refrigeration problem was on the roof. By that time, I learned that I needed to drag those heavy toolboxes every time we got out of the van. I did the same in this instance. I dragged those toolboxes up 4 flights of stairs and out on the roof. He was already there and waiting. He hadn't told me what we were going to do, and at that time, I wouldn't have had any idea what to do anyway. He reached down one of the toolboxes and pulled out a screwdriver. He pushed in a set of contacts, read a couple of gauges, and with that, we put the screwdriver back in the toolbox. He started to walk away, and I just kept watching him. At the doorway, he said, "Are you coming?" I asked him, "Is that all?" He, of course, told me I should have asked what we were going to do before I ever hauled all those tools upstairs. Back down the stairs I went, lugging all those tools, and then once again driving without conversation to our next refrigeration call. This call was down in a dirty basement where they had placed the refrigeration equipment on a dirt floor. After dragging those toolboxes to the work area, he looked at me and told me I brought the wrong stuff once again. "You're never going to make it." He told me to go outside, get the Freon tank, and bring it down to the basement, dragging those damn toolboxes with me. Elmer stood on one side of the coil, which was plugged with dirt and grime, while I was on the other side with the Freon hose in my hand. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Are you going to blow this out or not?" With that, I knew I would be in trouble, but I turned on the hose as fast as I could and blew that nasty stuff all out of the coil directly in his face. He choked and was pissed. I simply looked at him and reminded him I did what he told me to do. He stomped out of the basement, and I followed with a big smile, dragging that Freon bottle behind me to return it to that messy van. I was really tickled, but I couldn't laugh. We were working on another unit, and somehow or another, I couldn't get the thread started on a bolt. "Turn it to the right, stupid." I had become punch drunk after working a few weeks with Elmer. He had me questioning even the things I knew were right. We drew a work order to work on a beer chiller in a local tavern. As always, I drug 100 pounds of tools inside so he could use 5 pounds of them. We got into a situation where the space was very tight and hot. I crawled back into a place where I could barely move. I had to take apart a couple pieces of pipe, remove a valve, and then put up a new hanger and reinstall it. To put this in context, we had just worked on a job where one of the bolts had reverse threads. Of course, I was stupid because I didn't know it was a reverse thread, so I was still a little punchy. It was getting hot and claustrophobic being in the hole. Elmer kept yelling at me to hurry up. One of the bolts threaded just fine. The other bolt came apart just fine, but failed to hit the starter thread and kept spinning. That's when I had a major brain fart. I was trying to start it as a reverse thread. Elmer looked at what I was doing and quickly reminded me how stupid I was. Finally he said, "Turn it to the right. Haven't you ever closed a ketchup bottle?" With that, threads finally lined up. I tightened it up and it didn't leak. By this time, it was quitting time, and I was more than glad to crawl out of that hole and get back to the shop. Normally in the evening, the guys all came into the shop to go over the day, tell stories, and get lined up with wherever they were going to drink that night. Walking into the shop, I saw Elmer walk into the back room. He was gone, I was glad, and the world was right. Just then, he reemerged with a fruit jar full of nuts and bolts. In front of everybody, he gave me that jar and announced that he was sending this jar home with me as a homework assignment. "I want you to put all the nuts on all the different bolts. See, some are different sizes, and some are not the same thread pattern. Very complicated." With that, everybody had a big laugh. I took the jar home, completed it, and returned it the next day. It sat on the corner of the table for a long time, a threading mistake I've never repeated. My last day with Elmer. I had long put up with Elmer and his abusive attitude. He taught me how to carry tools and be prepared, but nothing about what to do when I got there. After 6 months in the program, I was concerned whether I'd ever learn anything. Once again, we met at the shop first thing in the morning. Elmer received his worksheets for the day, and of course I never got to see what they said. It turned out that our first project of the day was to remove and replace a solenoid valve at Galesburg High School. Once at the site, Elmer walked directly into the building, leaving me waiting and not knowing what to do. It had been long enough that I'd finally walked into the work area and asked Elmer what was up for the day. He begrudgingly told me. Becoming the tool hauler champion of the world over the last few months, I knew we needed a ladder, pipe cutter, B-tank, and sanding cloth. To keep all this in context, the starting wage at that time for a plumbing apprenticeship was $1.76 an hour. Money was tight since I'd been married just a couple of years and was now blessed with a new baby. Elmer had taken the solenoid valve apart and reached down to put the parts in my hand. I, of course, dropped them on the floor. With that, Elmer became unglued. He told me that if I didn't find all the parts, I'd have to pay to replace them out of my own pocket. It was a $10 valve. At that point, something snapped in my mind. I was tired of Elmer's gup. I was sick of being broke. I looked at him, grabbed the ladder, and started shaking it. Mad as I was at the time, I looked up at this man trying to hold the B-tank and all his tools at the same time. Dropping that tank could have been a real problem. At that point, I didn't care. I kept shaking and screaming, "You son of a bitch, come off that ladder and I'm going to kick your ass." He finally spoke up and told me to go directly to the van and stay there. I stood, watched him for a few seconds, and went to the van. After about 45 minutes, he came out of the building and got into the van. He left his tools, started the van, and headed for the shop. That's when he told me he was going to make sure I got fired. I was just sick to my stomach, but I wasn't going to put up with him any longer. We arrived at the shop, and other journeymen were picking up their parts. Elmer jumped out of the van and told them he was going to get me fired. They looked at each other and asked why. Elmer enjoyed explaining why in detail. Pennington spoke up and said, "I've been surprised he's lasted this long with a full-blooded asshole like you are. The only thing that disappoints me is he didn't kick your ass. You might want to check, but he's out of his official probationary period, and you can't fire him. To the best of my knowledge, I never did check if I was in or out." Pennington told me to get in his truck, and I'd work with him from now on. He also told me that if I ever offered to whip his ass, I was going to have to go through with it, win, lose, or draw.